Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch. Hello, Ben. How you going?
G'day, mate. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. So I've got a question for you. Do you know a couple of weeks ago in Melbourne where they flicked over to daylight savings time?
Yes.
I just want to check. When you woke up in the morning, was that okay? Did you put your clocks forward an hour?
2 weeks ago, yes.
Yeah, you did?
They all moved, yep. But did the Collingwood Football Club, is that what you're asking? Whether they...
Oh, you're front-footing it, are you?
Is that where you're going with this?
Expenses attack. So I'm just wondering, because the reason I wanted to ask is because I want to see if there was a thing in Collingwood where you all didn't actually put your clocks forward forward an hour, because I mean, did Collingwood mentally, were they an hour behind?
I'm incredibly
on the weekend?
proud of the boys. We put up a good fight.
Mate, you say that every week.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, you only need to ask them in terms of that they'd be disappointed with the result. And if that's a bit of fire in their bellies for next year, then
can I throw some things at
you? Yeah, go for it.
Witches' hats?
Oh, yeah, that's a bit rough.
Witches' hats?
Can I throw something at you?
Oh, hang on.
Would you have been... All right, I'll take it all. And then
at me. Come on.
Well, are you happier that your team made it to the second round of the finals, or would you prefer to be in the bottom 8 where you didn't even show up?
I planned for this, right? I knew that's where you're going to go, so I planned for it, right? So another one I wanted to ask: are you missing Justin Longmuir? Because I mean, if you had him back in the back line, you probably wouldn't have 6 points. At 6 points, Ben.
The back line wasn't our problem, Bryce. Although we had a few scores. We were cooked. Obviously, it was very evident that mentally we didn't show up.
I feel a bit like there was just this excitement that I had brewing all week about this particular part of our show today, and then I started to feel a bit bad for you, mate. We're mates.
Nothing to feel bad about.
I don't want to kick anyone while they're down. So what I did, Ben, is I went out to the community and I tried to get some support for you. So on Instagram, Michael Sapazzi said, "Hi, Bryce. Looking forward to Ben's Collingwood discussion this week in the podcast. Wonder if he will revise the 60.97% win record he spoke about last week." So there's an opportunity for you to contribute, Ben. So
maybe 60.8 now, bro.
Okay. And then another one of my friends on Insta, handle is Through the Lens of Life. "Hey, mate, hope you're having a great weekend." Obviously got it the day after the game. Yeah. "Could I request at least 15 minutes of banter for episode 308 over the Collingwood score from last night, and that they didn't even make 50 points, Ben? This will be next level gold for the community." So, Ben, this is not me talking. This is the community. So I'm on your side. Just for the avoidance of doubt, I'm on your side of the fence.
Absolute rubbish. You're on my side.
So what I did, I've got more, mate.
In the arena.
I've got more. So 15 minutes was the request. So I went to the Ibis and I said, "Ibis, I'm feeling for Ben. I think we should put a virtual hug and support him and make sure he's not feeling vulnerable at this time while his team got flogged." So what I did is I said, "Can you please put a tile out onto our Facebook and just say, hey, does anyone want to send messages of support to Ben?" Right? So I'll just read a few to you. Is that okay?
Sure. So, although for the record, I'm very comfortable in my own skin and I'm not vulnerable.
No, that's fine. Yep. So I like the way that you're playing this. It's fair enough. You've got to come with a few tricks because you've got very little to play with. So Caleb Gray on Facebook said, "I was there. Hope he enjoyed the first 2 minutes 30 seconds where it was competitive." Fair call, Dave. Then we've got Gerald Vandermeer. Far too much celebration after the elimination final victory. Ben, I feel bad for you because I was asking for support and this is what people are coming back for. So
sure.
Hopefully there's a few in here. Michael Montgomery. "Maybe it's time he followed a real team like the Melbourne Storm." So he's obviously giving some advice around
Go to the Storm. There we go.
Helpful. Mitchell S. Bainan. "The Pies were strongly negative geared." That's fair.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like the weaving in of the property message in
Yeah.
it. Yeah, good. That's
Yeah,
a good one. Thank you.
That's good.
That's pretty good.
Alistair Maxwell said they didn't just lose, they got pantsed.
Yep.
Might quickly move on from that one. Luke Patterson to get on the Storm bandwagon. At least they consistently turn up. Again, some code advice for you. This one from Chris Taylor. Didn't see Collingwood on the park. Were they playing? Question mark. So again, you've got the right to reply here, Ben, if you need. Ken Abbott wants to know who you're playing in round one next year. Obviously, it quickly moved on. Linka Loganathan, just remember to avoid an argument as per the book, Bryce. So I appreciate that because it means the previous mindset unit stuff is landing. So
Win
that's fair
friends
enough.
and influence people. Yes.
Alexandra Skelton, nothing better than watching the Pies get flogged. TD Styler, when will my suburb be renamed to something better? Now, do they live in Bulimba? Do they live in Peppermint Grove? No, they live in Collingwood Park, Ben. When will the suburb be renamed? Mark Swan. Don't think they even rocked up. Mark Anthony, what time is the game against Geelong starting? David Broadhurst joined the Tiger Army, and I think we should leave the last word to Mitchell Wood, who says this. Does he want to watch the 2018 grand final on repeat with me? Ben, is this fair? Like, I asked for people to support you, and that's what
I'm
you
just
got.
saying, mate, all I can say is go to the Magpies.
Go to the Magpies. So,
go to the Port Adelaide Magpies.
well,
no,
well played.
I'm very happy. You give it, you got to take it. So very good. I'll just finish with very happy to be the man in the arena. I think the boys would be very happy that they had a go, did their best, didn't deliver. They understand that. We understand that. We're very proud of them for the season, and we look forward. We don't look back.
You were going to pull out the man in the arena, so I came prepared. Ben.
Well, because we'd had a chat about this earlier.
Port Adelaide, 2007 grand final, 119 points they lost by. Do you think they're pulling out the man in the arena, or are they thinking, oh, let's just move on? Just pondering that question. And then GWS last year, 2019, they lost by 89 points, Ben. Do you reckon they're pulling out the man in the arena quote, or are they just going, oh, cringe, I think we should move on?
I think as a supporter, don't you want to be at the big dance, or do you want to go as deep into the finals as you can? I mean, that's the whole point about supporting a team, isn't it? Most weeks, if you're winning and you're getting to that pointy end of the season, i.e. the 60% greatest win-loss ratio in the history of the sport, you might be thinking...
Is that VFL or AFL? Because the national game's
combined.
AFL. So can I bring the waffle in, include East Fremantle and South Fremantle wins?
Well, if you're playing park footy, go for your life, mate. I mean, if you want to play in, what was considered the best league in the country, come over to Victoria. But that was a bit of fun. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you, crew, community. I loved every minute of that.
Yeah.
I think Ben deserved every second of that, and he was very, very good sport, as he always is. Hey, folks, shout out Summer Series. Just doing a shout out that we did a Summer Series last summer, Ben, and it was terrific. We got people on. So we want to showcase money transformations with Money Smart. So if you think that you've got a story to tell, we would love to tell it with you. So if you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/my story, if you go there, leave us some details. And anyone who comes onto the summer series, Ben, we're going to give them some digital course. We're going to give them books. We're going to give you a little
free course.
Yes.
Yeah, the coming on. Oh, that is awesome. Great.
Start and build course, right? So which is significant savings for folks. So just want to give people an opportunity to say, I would love to showcase my transformation, because if you were privy to the episodes we had last summer, I'm sure you'll agree they were so, me and you, we get up here every week, bang on, get Money Smarts. It's very simple. It's only 10 minutes a month. We bang it on. But the rubber meets the road when everyday people can actually use the system that's been created and transform their life, because we get enormous joy out of seeing the transformation. We do. And the community can actually take some inspiration from that. So I want to shout out to you. We're going to be recording those coming up. So we're starting the planning now. So if that's you want to be showcased, go to that website, thepropertycouch.com.au/my story, give us your details, and we would love to have a chat with you. That would be fabulous. So Ben, we look forward to that part of the year, don't we?
We do. It's amazing. It's very inspirational, very motivational, Bryce. So always good to hear those transformational stories. Share
it with us, folks. Share us your stories. And also just a little shout out, Ben, I don't normally do this, but we are hiring within our buyers agency team. So if you're an A grader, you want to work with a purpose-driven crew who are goal driven to get great client outcomes for our clients. If you feel like that's you, we would love to hear from you. So send us a little note. Go to the empowerwealth.com.au website, Ben. There is a careers section there. We got all the vacancies available there within our buyers agency team, our award-winning buyers agency. Ben, we're the buyers agent of the year. We would love for you to put your hand up, let us know, and we will chat to you. So there's a buyers agency role. You need to be experienced. You need to be Melbourne, Sydney based. And we're also got buyers agent associate, who is part of the support team that helps them deliver on that. So if that's you or someone you know, let them know. Send us an email at info@thepropertycouch.com.au or go to the website to check all that out. So, and the last bit of housekeeping for me today is just a tip of the hat to our good friend of the couch, Damien Collins, who is just been reappointed as president of the Real Estate Institute of Western Australia. Congratulations to Damien, and probably just a little shout out to him as well, as a good Collingwood supporter. There's always next year.
Very good.
All right, my Mindset Minute theme today, Ben, because we've got a very special guest. We got an amazing episode today. Our guest delivered some enormous gold. So before we get to that, I'm just going to go through Mindset Minute theme, continue the journey through how to win friends and influence people. I'm up to chapter 12, which is part of part 3, how to win people to your way of thinking. Chapter 12, the title of the chapter is If You're Wrong, Admit It. Can't make this stuff up, Ben. Like, how's the timing of that for you, in terms of if you're wrong, admit it. Okay, so I'll pause in case you want to fill the space. No, didn't take the opportunity. So if you're wrong, admit it. So the chapter goes on to tell that story. As per usual, all of the gold is in the stories, and I can't relay the stories by reading it. I've just pulled out some of the nuggets. Basically, it was along the lines of this person was in the woods, walking the dog, clear instructions not to walk the dog off the leash. The police on a horse come across, see the dog, give him a reprimanding, gives him a warning, no problem. A week later, the same person, after using the leash for the week, decided to let it off. The leash, Ben, goes over the hill. What do they see? The horse on the policeman on horseback, and just knew that we're going to get towed up. So basically went up to the police person and said, "You're wrong, I'm wrong, I shouldn't have done it." And the police, just by taking that stance, by admitting that they were wrong straight away, what it did is it changed the power position, where if we remember to a previous chapter of this book, it talked about the desire for every human being to feel important. So there is an opportunity to allow that police person to feel important in this scenario, because if you admit it, they actually and totally disarm the scenario. The policeman actually flipped on its head and said, "Oh no, you're okay. And no, I'm wrong. I shouldn't have done it. You made it very clear that I shouldn't have done it." Police person's like, no. All of a sudden, for them to feel important, they actually have to let the person off the hook. Otherwise, they can't get their sense of or need for importance by agreeing. So that was the story. I thought it was a really good story. So the goal is to arouse important significance in the other person. So any fool can try to defend his or her mistakes, and most fools do, but it raises one above the herd and gives one a feeling of nobility and exaltation to admit one's mistakes. And when we are right, let's try to win people gently and tactfully to our way of thinking. And when we are wrong, and that will be surprisingly often if we are honest with ourselves, let's admit our mistakes quickly and with enthusiasm. Not only will that technique produce astonishing results, but believe it or not, it is a lot more fun, because under the circumstances, it's better than trying to defend oneself. So remember the old proverb, by fighting, you never get enough, but by yielding, you get more than you expected. So principle number 12, if you're wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically, Ben.
Sounds like great advice, Bryce.
Hey, there you go, folks. Hopefully that helps you through the week. If you get to a situation, allow the other person to feel important by admitting your mistakes very, very quickly, and with enthusiasm. Hey, we've got a very special guest today, don't we?
We have a huge guest.
Yeah, I reckon I've been looking forward to having Eliza Owen from CoreLogic onto the podcast. We recorded this earlier with her. The interview, she's articulate, she's considered. She just rattles off history like she's just read it, the stuff this morning. Very, very awesome interview that we had with Eliza. So let's cut to the chat we had with her right now. All right, Ben, we got a very special guest today. We
Huge
have
guest. Huge guest.
Eliza Owen with us. She is on the couch. Eliza Owen is the head of residential research Australia at CoreLogic. Eliza has a wealth of experience in property data analysis and reporting. She worked, Ben, as an economist at Residex, a research analyst at the Domain Group, and previously as the commercial real estate and construction analyst at CoreLogic. She specialises in descriptive and inferential data analysis, data visualization, and framing data trends with broader economic concepts. Alongside her career in property data and research, Eliza is passionate about explaining economic concepts to broader audiences. And she also unpacked the housing affordability on the TEDx stage and has been regular commentator for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, the ABC, and commercial radio and television all across the country. Welcome to the Property Couch, Eliza.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. We're excited to have you on, but that's quite a CV that you've got there. So clearly, to be in the position that you're in, there's a few runs on the board. But before we actually get to where you are now, which is clearly one of the leaders in your space, that wasn't always the case. There was a time when you were trying to get your foot onto the professional ladder. So can you take us back there and tell us what it looked like for you to have the pathway to be such a specialist in what you're doing, and was property always a spark for you, or was there something else that got you onto this pathway, and then something came from left field that got you where you are now?
Yeah, so I didn't really expect to do real estate research and analysis when I started university. I was studying economics at the University of Sydney, and when I started, I wanted to be, head of the World Bank, or I think something really world-changing. And after my first year, I'd moved out of home to be closer to the university. I needed a job, so I got a job in a call centre, and that happened to be the call centre of Residex, where we would call up real estate agents and ask them for recent sales information. And as I went through with my time at Residex, studying economics, staying up until 1 a.m. watching shows like Selling Houses Australia or Escape to the Country, I realised that I was really getting into real estate and was really fascinated about urbanism, how we organise ourselves, how we make these decisions that have so much influence on our lifestyles and our communities. So I've just been extremely lucky that I had that foot in the door. I had people like, John Edwards, who was the founder of Residex, really believe in me and allow me to start editing reports and work with him. And then later, meeting other property experts, Tim Lawless. Largely, Residex was sort of acquired by another company called On the House, and then On the House was acquired by CoreLogic. So that's sort of how I came to be at CoreLogic initially. And yeah, I've just had an extremely lucky journey through those organisations.
It's classic mailroom right through to the top, isn't it? Because it's like it's been at the grassroots. What was some of the, you said you were up late watching television shows. What were some of the sparks that I noticed you didn't say location, Australia as well, but that's okay.
That was intentional.
Yeah, exactly. That was all part of the plan, right?
Good one.
Because clearly going down an economics path and you wanted to be a leader in a bank and all those sorts of things, there's clearly, property is a specialised stream. When was there a moment? Was there anything in particular that kind of thought, well, this is where I want to channel my energy, or was it just an accumulation of the shows and the opportunities that you're having?
I think the big one for me was, I would have started working in Residex around 2011, 2012. And as you'd know, by 2013, 2014, we started to see this enormous housing boom in Sydney and Melbourne, where property values were increasing by as much as 20% in a year. And I didn't have a proper career yet. I hadn't had a chance to get a foot in the property ladder. And I thought, well, hang on, this doesn't seem fair. So that's where I got very engaged with issues around housing affordability. issues around rental affordability and what the landscape looked like for tenants. And so that's sort of how I started writing content and just putting think pieces out there and trying to gauge other people, particularly young people, and how they felt about it as well. And I guess in economics, I think a lot of people get into the study of economics because they want to use it to make the world a better place, to understand the world and reform it to be more utilitarian and work well for everyone. So that's, I guess, where the tools I had in economics were sort of marrying with this newfound passion that I had in housing, affordability, and real estate.
So that's fascinating, and obviously to have some time with John Edwards, who is one of the legends in the industry. I remember going to a talk of his in the early 2000s, which was quite informative and sort of formatted a lot of my thinking at the time and validated a couple of those points. So I'm curious, someone like you're saying before about housing affordability and having chats with John, when you were saying things like it's not fair, what was his responses to that? It's like, this is supply demand at work, this is how it is, you need to get around it? Or what were some of the takeaways he gave you that you just got to think, well, I've got to get on with this, or I've got to in terms of move forward with my property strategy myself?
To be honest, he was quite surprised, I think, at some of the growth rates that we were seeing in Sydney and Melbourne at the time. And a lot of it came down to high levels of investment that were happening in the market in particular. The ABS lending data indicated that around 2014, we actually saw more money being taken out across New South Wales for the purpose of investment purchases than for owner-occupier property. And that basically meant that more people were buying property,
second and third and fourth properties. Yeah,
exactly. And this idea potentially of using the equity to reinvest in the market as well. What was interesting about that, and I think a lifelong lesson that I've learned about the property market, is that it doesn't operate in a vacuum. And rather than things spiraling out of control, we had interventions from APRA, who, put the growth on investment lending was capped at 10% a year. We had a 30% cap on interest-only lending introduced. And that sort of did really calm things down. And I think especially as it does become more sort of accessible, and you can see how the property market is moderated by those institutions to an extent as well.
What's a day in the life of you, Eliza? I mean, there's a team there, and how do you stay across the amount of data that you need to stay across to stay well informed? Because you and I recently did a webinar together with the REIQ, so you have to be front facing and project numbers in a way that's digestible to a lot of people. But to be able to get to that position, what does that look like for you?
I think just over time, you kind of learn the key data outputs that you need to look out for and the institutions that are going to be providing the best advice. One of the good things about working for CoreLogic is that you just have so much property information and really sophisticated analytics at your fingertips. A lot of the analytics are imputed. So rather than waiting for all sale records to come from the VG, we have modeled sales volumes where we're trying to estimate the volume of contracts that are being signed in a particular month. So that's been very useful. And I would say to anyone who's interested in understanding what's going on in the property market and how the property market will be shaped, you keep up to date with what the RBA puts out. You keep up to date with what APRA is putting out and the announcements. So even just as, something as simple as going to the APRA website and subscribing to their newsletter. So as soon as you see like a changing to lending laws come through or something like that, you can sort of stay up to date with it.
The Ben and I were chatting the other day, and I'm going to steal one of his ideas, but he's talking about, and you may or may not agree with it, but Ben was saying he thinks that economists see property as a service, as opposed to seeing the ego and the self-esteem and all of the non economic factors that go into property. So therefore, when you have an economist forming a view on property versus a view on everything else. Whereas you're quite uniquely positioned because you've got this economist training and this economist background, and yet you're specialising in property. Do you have a view on that in terms of economists making commentary about property and whether or not they do take into account what Ben was describing around the human status component of real estate rather than just seeing it purely as a service?
I'll elaborate a little bit more. So fair value is rent over running costs less capital growth. So that's the model that most economists, i.e. from the RBA and potentially the bankers, and those who are also probably naysayers of the property market will sometimes gravitate to. And it does make sense because the vast majority of the marketplace, that makes sense to me. Why would why would a property be worth more than that, as opposed to if I could rent it cheaper, significantly cheaper, I'm better off renting, versus if obviously it's more cheaper to buy, I'm better off buying. And that's what's referred to as fair value when an economist looks at this type of property asset. But they look at it as a service of shelter. They don't necessarily look at it as a class, an asset class. Like, I mean, who would have thought that Bitcoin would be an asset class? Or if it is, there's still great debate around that. But obviously gold is an asset class and other things. And so all of a sudden it can be a store of value. And that's potentially what moves land values in certain areas as opposed to others. And that's the concept that I was referring to. Yes,
that makes sense. I've seen that before as well. And I think it's fair to say that, with rental yields nearing record lows in Sydney and Melbourne, that particularly in those cities, but certainly in others we've seen historically as well, do become very divorced from that fair value. I think it comes back to, some of the policies that have changed the relationship between rents and property, for example, negative gearing. And as you say, the fact that there is a kind of valuing of property that comes from expectations of further capital growth increases, record low mortgage rates as well. And I think that the accumulation of wealth that it does serve over time, for sure.
Well, it comes back to the debate of fair value versus market value. See, so fair value is a theoretical concept. Market value is what a willing buyer is prepared to pay a willing seller, and whether there's support at that price range from that willing buyer. In other words, whether there was competition behind that. Because in sitting down and talking to a lot of valuers, you do have this debate. I mean, ultimately there is a methodology, or two methodologies that most people use for valuation purposes, but the valuer is still using a form of art and science as a blend to try and establish that. But my question, the big question for me is always around how does that value flow into the land? Because most economists, when I ask them that question, most valuers, when I ask them that question, are like, that's a really good question. How does it ultimately find its way into the land value as opposed to just in the improvements? Because obviously the improvements are deteriorating. So it does make for fascinating reports when you see this, as you say before, this large macro assessment of the market. When, in speaking with you and Tim in the past, there are lots of markets within markets, but the economist's view of the world is a regression to the mean. And that regression to the mean is around a 6% long-term return on capital growth on properties. That's sort of what they've done. And that report that came out from the RBA referred to lower interest rates moves that fair value higher because ultimately the cost of acquiring is better than the cost of holding. But as you've said, the lower the rent coming down has also meant that may taper itself out, and we may not see that growth level across the market with the rising tides lifting all ships.
For sure.
Mental note for me to make sure I just throw to Ben to ask the question in the first place, because that probably would have been a better option. Hey, you did a TEDx talk on housing affordability. Can you give us sort of the highlights? What were the conclusions and what were some of the discussion points that you had during that talk?
Yeah, it was that was maybe 5 years ago now that I did that talk. I think since I've done it, I've sort of developed and maybe matured some of my views on the housing market a bit. The essence of it was literally just to explain the concept of a percentage value increase rather than a dollar value increase, because some of the conversations that were being had about housing affordability at the time was, this isn't the biggest boom that we've seen because prices have only gone up 20% this year, whereas in the 1980s they were going up 35% before interest rate increases. And just to use that as an example and spell that out and say, well, yes, that 35% was off a far lower base. So actually in, real dollar value terms, we're seeing a larger boom at the moment. And it might seem like such a basic thing, and it is, I suppose, but it's amazing when you speak to people that so many people just don't really understand what a percentage value increase is, and that's not their fault. That's the way we've, potentially neglected the importance of this kind of basic mathematics or basic concepts in economics. So just unpacking that idea to kind of contextualize price increases that we were seeing in Australia. And then to finish off the talk, I was like, well, you can listen to people who tell you that the way to reform housing affordability is tax reform, something around negative gearing, something around capital gains. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you don't have a voice in this debate. So you need to, this is why we need to embrace studies around economics, finance, tax, just so that, I guess, to democratize it a bit more and make sure that everyone can have a voice in those sorts of debates.
Well, as being someone who's had a look over certain periods of time, obviously millennials think that it's more unaffordable now than in the past. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so I think there are many different measures of housing affordability that we take into account at CoreLogic. So we look at measures like the years taken to save a 20% deposit. We look at the house price to income ratio. We look at incomes to typical mortgage repayments, and we also look at incomes to rents. And so, unsurprisingly, when we look at serviceability of home ownership, the fact that we're at record low mortgage rates, a record low cash rate, serviceability has been improving. So where we see a deterioration in affordability is, typically the deposit hurdle, and that kind of serving as a big barrier to entry for young people, and that sort of becoming worse over time. So, out of that, we've seen the government, particularly the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, take this view of, well, we need to balance out the equity in housing. We need to balance out the wealth in housing and what it serves there for the Australian homeowners. Because as you sort of alluded to before, Ben, so much of personal wealth, so much of the way property is built into our taxation and finance means that home ownership can be the difference between a comfortable retirement and a retirement of poverty. So balancing that need to provide a source of wealth for Australians with accessibility to home ownership, and that's where we got the first home loan deposit scheme. So really saying, rather than trying to bring prices down, it's about incentivizing first home buyers and giving them sort of a leg up with as little as a 5% deposit. What was the question?
No, that's right. Because the consequences, I'll double click on that. The consequences aren't they, Eliza, that the unintended consequences of trying to reduce prices so everyone can potentially get in has a wealth effect impact, and that in itself, in terms of trying to reset a new baseline of value, can have dangerous consequences, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if we look to Ahuri produced some data, it was a while ago now, I think it would have been maybe 2010, and it showed that a large portion of home owners were actually using equity in their homes in their retirement, and a lot of that was being used towards healthcare, for example. So we can see that while you have expensive or rising costs of healthcare, home ownership and the value of property then becomes important for that facet of these stages later in life as well. So it's all very interlinked, and I think that there is sort of a dependence in a way on the wealth that Australians have in housing. We know over 50% of household wealth is held in property. So that's sort of where approaches to not even housing affordability, but just housing accessibility have had to sort of balance that out.
Speaking of the whole housing debate, I want to spend a minute in just talking about the social housing element. We've obviously just come out of a budget and there was a lot of pressure for the government to potentially put something around social housing. We've got a chronic need and a chronic shortage of places for social housing, and we've seen potentially the Labor Party start to address that, and obviously the Greens are very strong in that area as well. What is the view of your own or CoreLogic's, or what's the input that you give into the conversation that we should be considering as we, as you say, democratise the knowledge so we can all have an informed conversation around this?
I mean, for CoreLogic, we've historically just been more involved with sort of the private sector housing segment in terms of the services that we deliver for empowering decisions around property. I think there is something in this argument of direct funding and government investment for the building of government housing, for social housing. Whereas I think if we look at the landscape, there has been a real pivot from provision of social housing by government to innovative financing for the community housing sector to provide affordable housing. The problem being that the latter relies on the uptake of that finance, whereas a government direct investment into a building project that provides affordable housing or social housing rather, it kind of guarantees that the project is getting done. And I think that kind of comes back to this idea of viewing housing as infrastructure, as social infrastructure, as something that lays a foundation for well-being and has multiple social benefits. So, I'm not necessarily an expert in that kind of public sector segment, and I'm sure there are people who are working in the community housing sector who can speak to it much better than I can. But just interesting to note that kind of observation where it seems to be guided by an ideology that the community housing sector is better attuned to the needs of the community, and so they're trying to specialise it through that kind of delivery.
It sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Because, I mean, the problem or the challenge with any government who is providing housing, because housing is meant to be a state-based or territory-based matter, is the ongoing cost. It's all well and good to build it, but then maintaining it and the upkeep. So I'm a huge advocate for these community housing groups who are building these things, and also the shared equity models where you're basically, you're getting these people into the home and then they can buy it off the government over time. That makes perfect sense to me, because there's going to be a care for that asset and a care for that property better than potentially what we sometimes can see in social housing, where someone's lived there for 3 years and they've moved on, and all of a sudden the whole place needs to be repainted, retiled, refurnished, and that's very expensive for government, as opposed to potentially these people who can get into these properties in these right locations through community housing or these share equity type models. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it was interesting that in the private sector component, we just saw this kind of expansion of the first home loan deposit scheme. And interestingly, it's only for the construction or purchase of newly built properties. If we look to, around the GFC, where the government introduced a boost, or the temporary boost to the first homeowner grant, that was added incentive for new builds, but it could be established or new builds. But 85% of the take-up of the scheme was in established property. I think it's interesting, especially when there's been a bit of bad press recently about, the quality of some new builds and things like that, whether the take-up will be as fast for those added spots to the first home loan deposit scheme as well.
You mentioned a couple of things that were announced in the budget there, the first home loan deposit scheme. What were some of the other observations that you had with respect to property as a result of, the gargantuan budget that we were just a part of?
I mean, there wasn't a whole lot, I think, in addition to first home loan deposit scheme. There was continued funding of state-based government housing. There was that piece on for eligible applicants, the exemption of capital gains on granny flats, which from reading the budget papers was going to have a negligible effect on tax revenue. So I get the sense that that particular policy would be very targeted. And then I think just what was interesting was the big sort of headline piece of the budget around JobMaker, Job Trainer, and really targeting reabsorption of labour for young people, where we saw about 40% of the people who have lost their jobs through the pandemic so far have been those aged between 15 and 24. And that's been very important for us to understand with relation to housing. The idea that COVID really impacted what we call social consumption. It was a decline of the operation of restaurants, pubs, cafes, theatres, hospitality, tourism. The people that were working in these sectors were more likely to be young. And the reason that was a crucial for us to know, absolutely fantastic of the ABS to be producing that payroll data by industry, we're seeing that the biggest job losses have been in accommodation and food services, arts and recreation. And if you cross that with AHURI data, which shows people in those industries are more likely than any other to be renters. So that's where we've seen, the biggest source of, or one of the largest sources of unemployment have had a sort of indirect relationship to housing in that they are more likely to be renters. And that combined with closure of international borders, is where we've seen the biggest hit to the rental markets, where 80% of people, roughly, when they first come to Australia, are renters.
So take us back to March, April, Eliza. You're sitting down, you, Tim, and the team are having a think tank. The data centre at CoreLogic are having a think tank about where to for the property market and where to for property prices. What was the to be a fly on the wall in that conversation would have been fascinating, right? Because we were doing the same thing. We were sort of hypothesising known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, all of that type of stuff. Where did you see it going, and is it sort of played out as the brains trust at CoreLogic thought, or has it sort of moved and shifted in a different direction?
Yeah, so we started thinking initially, should we put in for leave? No. We started with history. We went back and we looked at the movement of property values through previous negative economic shocks. We couldn't go back to the 1930s, but we went back through sort of early 80s in terms of negative economic shocks, and generally found that property values were not really that impacted. Even looking at the past 30 years, the biggest decline on the national view was the decline through 2017, 2019, and that was a peak to trough decline of 8% nationally. What we found was very reactionary and was very volatile was transaction activity. So with the onset of a negative economic shock, if it was such that it was financial and going to impact lending and the property market, we found that people really just held off transacting. We found that property is not like shares, for example, where you might get 20% of value wiped off in a single day. And the reason for that is that property as an asset is slower to transact. It has higher barriers to entry and exit. And so you don't get a mass sell-off of property during a crisis or a run to property or anything like that. It's a much slower moving asset. As a result, we've seen through the coronavirus pandemic over the past 6 months, nationally, property values have only come down 2%. In many capital cities, they've actually increased because of the cash rate reductions. And of course, that's another feature of an economic downturn, is that the RBA moves to make debt cheaper. And because Australians have what we call a high elasticity of demand for property, they're more likely to buy when interest rates come down. Those who still had a job and still had their sort of income intact, it sort of served to stimulate demand in a lot of cities as well, to the extent where, you've got Darwin, the ACT, Adelaide. These property markets have seen an increase in value since the onset of the pandemic.
I remember just quickly in one of the presentations you were kind enough to do for our picker community, and I would have loved to have been in a live environment where you led with a point that higher unemployment actually equals higher property prices.
Yeah.
And everyone would have went, wait a minute, what, stop. And you were analysing a movement from 6.5% in unemployment up to 7.5%, 8%. And it comes back to your point around the RBA triggers an interest rate cut.
Yeah.
And it's that interest. So even though you've got growing unemployment, you've got growing property prices, because there is still the vast proportion of the population, as you say, that elasticity can move because they're gainfully employed. And that is pushing property prices because it's more affordable. So I love that. I really enjoyed that part of your presentation when you delivered that a few months ago. And that's probably landing for our community right now. Oh, that's right. That sort of makes sense. It makes money cheaper. And when money gets cheaper, there is a strong correlation, as you said, between lower cost of money and higher borrowing power, which then results in appreciation of property assets.
Yeah, and again, especially considering the people who will have lost their jobs recently. Unfortunately, it is a lot of young people.
Yeah.
But again, it doesn't present a direct risk to the property market because they're not the kind of people who would have been primed to buy anyway, probably.
You talked about the high elasticity of demand. For someone who's listened to that for the first time, can you explain what that means and how it relates to Australian property?
Just that we're very responsive to the price of debt. So that the cheaper borrowing is, the more inclined we are to demand mortgage debt to bid on property. And that's sort of why it pushes prices up at the time when cash rates are reduced and the cost of debt is cheaper. So the RBA have done some historic analysis suggesting that for a 1 percentage point reduction in the cash rate, this could lead to an 8% increase in property prices over the following 2 years, provided that the cash rate stays low over that period.
Was that 0.1 or 1%? I think it's
1 percentage point.
Yeah, 1 percentage point. So not 0.1, but 1 full percentage
Oh no,
point.
that'd be wild.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say. But
I'd never get in.
it was recorded at 17 to 28%. I read in the AFR recently that that was the sort of litmus of how they can move at this lower end, because obviously you've also got margin creep or what they call that, because the lower the percentage rate, the smaller the change in percentage, as opposed to the higher percentage rate, the higher the change in percentage.
Yeah.
Eliza, crystal ball time for you. I live in a regional area of Victoria. My next door neighbour is one of the preeminent real estate agents in this area. They had a property that they had on their books that was 3.2 to 3.4 was the quote price. They were about to wrap it up at 3.2, and then a buyer from Melbourne, sight unseen, entered the market and ended up going for 3.7. There's a rental around the corner where they had 28 applications. The top three that they were considering for a 650 townhouse was, the first one was someone who was prepared to pay 12 months in advance at 650, and the other two, one was prepared to pay 700 and the other one was prepared to pay 710. When you and I were doing the webinar a couple of weeks ago, that was in Queensland, we were talking about the fact that people are buying properties on the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast sight unseen. So these coastal I called them fringe commutables prior to COVID, are becoming more and more popular, and of course that's going to happen around the country. What's the crystal ball, or the, as Ben said, the brains trust at CoreLogic there? What are you folks thinking about what that means for fringe commutables and even stretch fringe commutable locations all around the country?
Yeah, I mean, I've no doubt that the way that COVID-19 has kind of normalized remote work, it is a massive structural impact that will definitely change. Well, I say definitely, nothing's certain, is it? But
Close enough.
But will people circle back?
Yeah.
Will people do a U-turn going forward? Because everything that is an offer in the city that everyone despises right now, when things go back to normal, if I want to take the boys to the MCG to the footy, it's an excursion. If I want to go to see a show on a Saturday night, it's an excursion. And I personally will never move back to the Big Smoke ever because I love what's on offer in region. But it's kind of more the people that that sort of are making a decision out of a pandemic that when in 3 years' time, when we're not really talking about it the same, it was only the mid 2000s when everyone was leaving Victoria. It was the last person to leave, turn the lights off. But then they got there and they realised that the networks had changed and they were missing some of the people from home. So it's kind of, for me, like it's a thing. There's no doubt it's a thing. I can see it on the ground. But I can't work out if it's a sustainable thing. Because I used the example of Indooroopilly up in Brisbane, for example. Had a mate who bought just after the 2011 flood, significant discount when everyone's going, why did you do that? And he made, not only did he buy himself a great property in Indooroopilly, spent some money on doing it up, but no one's talking about the flood anymore.
Yeah.
And that's still a wonderful spot. So it's kind of, I kind of can't get my head around if it's sustainable this time around.
There's a bit in there, and I agree, like nothing is certain. Populations are fluid, reactionary. One thing I would say is we saw this trend before COVID-19. We saw people leaving the metropolitans. We saw the biggest regions of in terms of the volume of net internal migration were the capital region of New South Wales, parts of regional Victoria, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, and that was a movement of people from inner city areas, even the fringe of cities, to those regions. So I think COVID-19 is amplified that trend that we were seeing anyway. As you say, there is this mitigating idea of like if enough people do pursue these regional areas and we do see more of an impact on inner city prices, that's a mitigating factor, right? The prices are falling in the city, so they may become more attractive as well. And I guess one thing I would say is that we've talked a lot, this narrative of the resilience of regional markets. They are still subject to a short-term cyclical downswing because they do tend to follow the capital city markets. Even Geelong and Ballarat, we've recently seen have declined in price over the 3 months to September, not as much as Melbourne. But these markets do tend to sort of follow the same cycles, and I think the extent of impact that we've seen to employment, it does have some downward pressure, even in the Illawarra, Newcastle regions. Their growth rates aren't as strong as they were, towards the peak of the cycle midway through 2019. So I guess you can't say that one thing will definitely happen, but I think that that this has definitely served to amplify the trend of living and working regionally, and can help people to realise these, what life can be like in a lifestyle market, and I would say would probably do more good than harm for regional prices in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at that crystal ball still, I'm privileged enough to be able to get access to the property market indicator summary that we get every weekend, and we see what's happening in the auction markets around the country. We see price movements based on your Hedonic Index. And I did note there on the Hedonic Index that there is quite a bit of movement in terms of some trends that we're seeing on the weekly change for our capital cities. In fact, there's only, as per this weekly change, and remember, a week does not necessarily signal a trend, but we see Sydney flat, Brisbane growing, Adelaide growing, Perth growing, Melbourne only negative 0.1 for the weekly change. What has been that trend for us, Eliza, and where do you see that going?
Yeah, so there was a real turn in the housing market over the month of September, where we started to see the clearance rate climbed back above its long-term average to be sitting at 64% for the month. property prices rose in all of the capital cities except for Sydney and Melbourne, and even in Sydney and Melbourne, the declines had softened. New listings volumes rose 9% over September, suggesting that vendors are now more confident about putting their property up. I think this is the fact that we've got record low mortgage rates converging with really the COVID pandemic becoming much more contained, and I think people being much more confident as a result. We are seeing that the worst of the impact to the economy was in the June quarter. Economic conditions are improving. We had ABS payroll data showing that, the labour force is starting to tighten up a little bit. So I think for the next few months, we're likely to see improvements in the property market. We're probably going to see those smaller cities continue to see value increases. I do think the major headwind will be March next year when we get the end of mortgage repayment deferrals. And I think, it may be quite a concentrated risk, but there probably will be these people that need to face up to their debts and sell their property if they can't repay by that time, which presumably would put downward pressure on whatever markets they're coming into.
And is that concentrated? That's always been my debate around the systemic risk, because you're right. The two headwinds are population growth or lack thereof for construction, medium, high density, rental accommodation. We're seeing rents drop considerably around inner city areas. So that's definitely a concern for any investor who's getting into the market to understand that they've got to be a little bit more conservative about rental for the short term. But yeah, that's always been my challenge around if the jobs are gone from the city, well, the city is fed by every region and every suburb and every locale. So with that in mind, how do you know where the systemic risk is, and will there be enough mortgagee and possession sales to put some pressure on prices, or will that be swamped by the pent-up demand of the first home buyer and the owner-occupier upgrading or downgrading during that time?
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say there may be a bit of a mismatch in stock types when we consider, owner-occupiers not necessarily wanting a one-bedroom apartment in the middle of the Melbourne CBD. But yeah, I think that overall we're definitely seeing areas where there are higher levels of risk. Whereas if, you look at some of our data where we've compared price changes or rental value changes with distance to CBD, the further from the CBDs of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane you get, the more likely we've actually seen property value increases and rent value increases. Another one of the indicators that we look to, obviously, is our pain and gain analysis, where we can actually look at the percentage of loss-making sales that we've seen over a period of time. And that's where we start to see really some of those pain points, which actually continue to be areas like, Perth and Darwin, but also in submarkets of Melbourne, for example, where we see that the Melbourne council region saw nearly 40% of sales in the June quarter were a loss relative to the previous sale. And that's up from, about 33% in the previous quarter. So that's where we can see that there definitely are pain points and there definitely are areas where property prices have been steeper, but it does tend to be quite a contained level of risk. And I think that's even more so due to the specific nature of the COVID-19 downturn.
How far in advance does your crystal ball go, Eliza, in terms of analysing the 20s as a decade? Because clearly there's a pause on population growth, but I can tell you at the coalface, our team is just like there is way too much pent up buyers activity compared to stock in the particular areas that we're looking at, right? So I agree that segmentally we've got to be careful to make blanket statements, but I guess going forward, what would you, and I guess you guys are in data analysis, not necessarily future predictions, but what is your analysis sort of saying for demand of real estate in this country for the remainder of the 20s as a decade rather than a year.
So I hope you don't mind me coming back with a question, but what are the demographics of the people that you're seeing that pent-up demand in?
Oh, well, in fact, price points anywhere from 400 up to 1.2. And typically speaking, we're competing up against, even though we're generally buying as an investor, typically we're at the lower end, we're competing with the first buyers, and at the top end, there's a heap of owner-occupier activity, because we're finding outside of an informed investor community that we're curating, the moratorium on evictions and all those sorts of things are quite spooky for an investor if they're hearing things at a headline level. But we're competing enormously with owner-occupier activity.
So I think the reason I ask is because, and I think we see that in the finance data as well at the moment, it's a lot more owner occupation. And I would say in the short term, there is this, the millennial generation, the largest adult generation, they're hitting the typical first home buyer age group now. The eldest of them are hitting the typical upsizing age group. And so there's probably a lot of demand that can offset, some of the decline we see from overseas migration. And many of them perhaps aided by the equity that their parents have in their home or what have you. So some short-term demand there. But yeah, I think we are going to get to this point where international borders will open up again. We'll perhaps have seen a paucity of development, as obviously that's sort of more risk for developers at the moment, particularly in the investment grade kind of property. The other thing I would say about the 20s is that the RBA have sort of committed to keeping the cash rate as low until they can get a full employment, so an unemployment rate of around 4.5%, and inflation's got to get back in that 2 to 3% band. Now that's probably not going to happen for a very long time. They're saying at least 3 years, so that's something that would be very accommodative of housing demand. I guess one thing to consider is that when interest rates do start to rise again one day, there's going to be a lot of people who have quite large mortgage debt, and that could have implications of dampening property prices. But, that would probably be more towards the end of the 2020s, I suppose, and would be a whole different ballgame. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's speculation.
I think it's all speculation. Ultimately, you're trying to read the play, but like any of these sort of things, it's inferred that income equals borrowing power. Yeah. And if income equals borrowing power and interest rates are low, then the more income you've got in the household, the greater the borrowing power. Now, if you then take that debt at a low level, and then things slow down or interest rates go up, then those households that have geared themselves to 80 or 90% are going to hit a wall. And the desire and for new buyers to come into that market is going to be sluggish. So we believe right now up until 2025, it's rising tides lifting all ships. Low interest rates, incomes there, household income. We're going to see pretty much a similar story than we saw in the early, the 2010, 2011 period that you were talking about there, Eliza, in terms of, the property prices were going higher because the cost of money was getting cheaper, right? So the second half of the decade is going to be interesting because of that, in terms of how quickly those interest rates rise. Because if those interest rates rise really quickly, then that means that the economy's booming, right? Because, the RBA isn't going to stall the economy just so they can get interest rates up, and they're going to wait for inflation anyway. So I think you make, some really good points there. So, and if the government of the day is focused on talented immigration coming in, those people want to, as per Bernard Salt's observations, they want to make good. They want to show the world, their people back home, that they've come to Australia and they've made good. Well, normally they make good in a big city where they get good incomes and they work really hard. And they're also, if from our Asian community, they love density. That's what they know. They understand that. So I still think that there's going to be, of the hundreds of thousands that arrive here, a real appetite for the bigger cities for them to, to make their good and to show their wares to be successful. So it is going to be fascinating in terms of what the decade holds.
I wonder if that could be a bumpy ride too, like if you get an increase in interest rates that has an impact on property values, wealth effects, the construction industry, and
You're right. That's why the lever is so dangerous to pull on monetary policy, isn't it? Right? Because ultimately, if it's, if you've got to run on inflation because you've got poor productivity, that's your challenge. So there's no doubt there's got to have to be IR reforms in that mix as well. Because if you don't get that, you're going to, you could have the ability of, as I said, stalling that, and with that stall comes, why did much for the property price? Because we had FOMO at the time, and now we might be regretting that decision. So we always say to anyone, take care out there. Property prices go up and they go down. But over the longer term, they seem to have gone up a lot more, and that's that 6% that that we're being told that they've gone up historically because of double household income. So it's interesting in terms of where it'll land.
Eliza, we've covered a fair bit in our chat with you, and we're incredibly grateful for the time that you've given to us, and as a result of that, to our community. So your insights are, I could sit here and continue to listen for a long, long time, but I've got to appreciate that you've got other things to do. But Ben and I certainly appreciate that you take the time to come on to the Property Couch, share your wisdom with our audience, and I reckon we should get you back on in at the end, early next year or at the end of this year, just to circle back, because I think there's some ongoing insights that you can provide. But I think a nice little look in the rear vision mirror there too. So we appreciate you coming on, and thanks for sharing with us.
I appreciate you having me. Thank you so much.
There you go, Ben. The idea there was to try and give some information clearly about current events, but right at the front end of that interview, there was so much evergreen concept that you can apply and overlay at any stage of your property buying journey. I just thought there was so much insights that, there's probably times when you had to pause, rewind, and go back and have a listen again.
Yeah, Eliza has been taught by some of the best brains in this space. John Edwards. You've got Tim Lawless, Cameron Cusher, all of those people that she's been able to think tank with, and also I suspect a lot of brains trust that's inside the organisation that may not necessarily have a media face to them. We are always enriched to be talking to great people like Eliza, who are willing to share their insights. Which benefits all of us as students of the property space. So thank you, Eliza. Wonderful stuff as usual, and also to our obviously great friends there at CoreLogic in terms of being able to provide that. And there is some awesome content that they have, both free and paid content, isn't there, Bryce? So their website, just Google CoreLogic. They are fantastic with their free content. Make sure you subscribe to that, and there's also got some excellent paid content as well, and I'll be giving a little sneak peek into one of their particular reports in my What's Making Property News, Bryce, very shortly.
Ooh, very good. So yeah, I think Stiggy might even sneak the link into the show notes too, Ben. So
beautiful.
Again, Eliza, thank you for coming on. I think our community will.
We look forward to getting her on again, don't we, mate?
Absolutely. Yeah, we will circle back and have her on. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is pretty much a COVID normal workplace life hack, and it's around we're all on Zoom. We use Teams in our building, but you could use Zoom, Google Hangouts. What are some other ones that I can't think of off the top of my head? But there's lots of them, right? There's lots of apps to chat to your colleagues, right? But we've all done it. We're all, I throw to you, Ben, what do you think about that? And then all of a sudden you're on mute, you're chatting away, and we're going, oh, Ben, you're on mute. And all of a sudden there's that look on the face, and then we scramble, we go, where's our cursor? And we try and find the mute button, and then all of a sudden what seems like 10 minutes later, but probably only 6 or 7 seconds later, you unmute yourself and you start chatting. So my life hack today is, and clearly I've done that a million times. So what I did is, if you hover, we're doing this in Microsoft Teams now, but wherever you are, if you hover over the camera and the microphone, in Teams, it gives you the shortcut. So for me, I'm on a Mac, so it's Command-Shift-O is for the camera, and Command-Shift-M is for mute. So if I'm ever scrambling, I now just use the keyboard shortcut. So what my life hack today is the invitation to everyone who's listening to this is to go and find out what your keyboard shortcut is, particularly for the mute button. But if you want to get into the advanced play, you can do that on, hand raising and leaving the call. But at the very minimum, find out what your shortcut is for the mute button and go and use it. Because for Windows users, it's Control-Shift-M. So it's something that I think going forward is a little skill that will help you keep meetings flowing really well. And if you do find yourself in that awkward position where you've just delivered some of your best gold on mute, scrambling for the button is probably going to make you forget what you did. So Ben, that's my life hack today.
Here's a sentence that you wouldn't have heard very often before COVID. Bryce is, I can see you, but I can't hear you. Anyone new to this type of work? We do a lot of obviously remote appointments for our clients all around Australia and overseas, but that was the fun bit. Like, have you used sort of web technology before and webcam? Can you see it? Can you hear me? I can see you, but I can't.
Yeah, exactly.
The joys of learning new technology.
Well, the thing, as you pointed out, for our business, we've been dealing in online environment for multiple years.
Yeah.
So COVID didn't kick us off on that, but clearly there's a few little tweaks that we can do along the way. So there you go, folks. Keyboard shortcut. Ben, what's making property news?
Right, I'll start with the pain and gain report that's released by CoreLogic. We've been kind enough to get a copy of the June quarter results, which is actually released this month. And the reason why it takes a little bit of time is because obviously they're waiting for all the results to be collated, as we mentioned with Eliza. So there is some interesting stuff in here, Bryce, and obviously this is measuring how many properties have been bought and sold for a profit or sold for a loss, hence the pain and gain. And I just thought I'd pick out a couple of interesting observations. Again, it's available on the CoreLogic website. Sydney for houses, Bryce. So again, it also measures average time periods that people hold their properties for, which is usually at the moment, the ones in this report are around 9 years. So the pain side for people in houses, so 6.3% of people who bought a house and sold it for a loss in the quarter, and 93.7 made a gain, Bryce, for houses. For units, 12.8% had pain and 87.2% had gain. So that's a unit market that has certainly outperformed. When we come to Melbourne, only 2.9% of people who sell their properties in Melbourne have sold for a loss. So that's a 97.1% gain for houses. For units, 15.4% have sold for a loss, 84.6% sold for a gain. But let's have a look at a couple of stressed unit markets compared to housing markets. Brisbane, 6.4% sold for a pain loss in houses, but 93.6% for a gain. Here's the unit market. 43% have sold at a loss. 57% have sold as a gain.
Ooh.
That's still not the worst market, Bryce.
Ooh. That's red or black at the casino, is that what you just said there?
The worst market is actually in more loss territory than gain territory, and that's unusual for property. So just remember, everyone, property is not a guarantee. Just throwing money at the property market is not a guarantee for a success. In the Perth market for the quarter, 32% of people in houses. That has been a struggling market, but I've got good news to finish with in a minute. 32.2% sold for pain, so that's a loss. So 67.8% for gain. Unit market, 57% basically sold it at a loss. 42% sold at a gain. Bryce, that's still not the worst unit market in Australia. You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Quickly get to Darwin, and I'll just do the unit market. 71.7% of all properties sold at a loss. 28.2% sold at a gain in the Darwin property market. So that is something that we have been educating our community on, because obviously the vast majority of the unit markets are apartments in medium and high density accommodation. And unless you do a lot of very, very detailed research and look at very unique properties, you are also potentially exposing yourself to risk. So please be careful when buying into the unit market, wherever you are considering that, and don't be sold on the fancy brochures and the sexy marketing materials. Bryce, this is the big news story of the week.
All right.
Westpac Melbourne Institute Index of Consumer Sentiment was released yesterday.
How'd we go?
Staged a remarkable comeback.
Come on.
Remarkable. Following the October federal budget announcement. The index rose an incredibly solid 0.9% in October to move to 105. Now, for those people who are not familiar with this, 100 is flatline. So if we are under 100, that means we're more pessimistic than optimistic. If it's above 100, it means there's more optimism than pessimism. So the index currently sits at 105. Now, Bryce, this is the highest level since July of 2018. But it gets even more fascinating.
Come on.
When we go into the time to buy a house index.
Okay.
It rose 10.6% to its highest levels since September of 2019. The increase in all states, Bryce, and here's the good news story for Western Australia. The index currently sits at 138. 138. South Australia, the other quiet sleeping market that we've always said is a smoky, 131. New South Wales, 120. Queensland, 118. Victoria, what do you reckon for Victoria? Negative?
Yeah.
More pessimist than optimist?
Yeah, no, I don't, based on what I'm seeing on the ground, Ben.
118, Bryce. Also in positive territory. I mean, it is what we've been saying, Bryce. We've been calm in saying it. With the property market, I tell you what, there is a pressure valve there, and it is starting to show up on the ground like we've been saying it is, and we think that that is going to obviously put pressure on some markets, which we called last week. And you're also hearing what Eliza's saying about what they're seeing on the ground as well. So that's showing up in our demand and supply ratio measures, and it's showing up in multiple offers on properties in certain areas of the market. Now, again, it's not carte blanche. Don't just go out and buy anything. There are still some risks. Don't forget, you've got to get rental. You've got to get people renting the property. There is going to be obviously a lot of oversupply of rental accommodation, so be careful there. Make sure you're provisioning for that. But all in all, that is some very, very positive numbers when it comes to consumer sentiment, Bryce.
Shout out to vendors, Ben. Can you please list your properties?
Yes, we do need about another 20% supply to come on the market, please.
Vendors.
Now it's time.
If you're wondering if now is a good time to sell, I can assure you there's buyers.
And if your agent's saying don't wait till February or whatever, and they're
not giving you a sales line.
Working through January, maybe there'll be some listings and buying going on in our big capital cities, because we really haven't had a marketplace, certainly down here in Melbourne, we haven't, for the spring season. It's been basically a closed shop. So it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Spring.
Yeah.
Everyone's gone down to the peninsula for a holiday in January. Well, they just brought it forward to had a holiday in their family room.
So there might be some auctions happening in January.
January will be an unusual month for Melbourne real estate, that's for sure. So very good. I think there was a bit in that for everyone today, Ben. So again, just a little shout out, Eliza. We appreciate you coming on. We certainly hope that served you as a community, folks. And Ben, until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, Bryce, but only if you act on it.
All right, folks. See you next week.
Hey there folks, Bryce Holdaway here. Before you go, if you're new to our community and only listened to maybe a handful of episodes, I thoroughly recommend that you go all the way back to episode number 1, where we unpack all of the foundations when it comes to property investing. Now, for those of you that might be a little bit time poor, I've got good news for you. We have a binge guide that you can download straight away, which summarizes the first 20 episodes where Ben and I unpack the foundational pillars of the A, B, C, D, and so much more. And you can get that straight away. If you go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20, you can download it and consume it whenever you want. It's completely free and available now. And for those of you, just a quick reminder that nothing we've spoken about today constitutes financial advice. We recommend that you reach out to your licensed professional advisor so that you can look at your unique circumstances before acting on any information. Now don't forget, go to thepropertycouch.com.au/TPC20 and get your binge guide today.